Chapter 1. The ancient stone of the manor house, known only as the anchor in the shadowed, forgotten chronicles of the bloodlines, exhaled the cold of centuries. It was not merely the atmospheric chill of the late November night, but a pervasive spiritual frost that seemed to cling to the very marble and dust. In the heart of this vast, skeletal edifice resided Lord Caelan, a creature whose existence was a self-imposed penance, a millennium-long quarantine. He was a vampire king by lineage, yet a self-proclaimed warden of his own gilded cage. Tonight, the moonlight, sharp and unforgiving, carved his silhouette against the leaded panes of the library, a tower of still, inhuman grace, draped in black velvet and older sorrow. His eyes, the color of frozen twilight, were fixed not on the aging, forgotten texts surrounding him, but on the shifting patterns of ash in the fireplace. His quietude was a weapon, honed by ages of waiting for an end that never came. He was defined by the heavy, invisible chains of a covenant sworn eons ago, to safeguard the last surviving line of the prophets, a line he had once nearly extinguished in a fit of youthful, bloody ambition. Guilt was his constant companion, a whisper louder than the storms that habitually lashed the cliffs below. He existed now only as a shield of polished, cold skin and formidable power, dedicated to a task he despised, protecting the very thing that proved his ancient error. His self-hatred was a deep, silent pool, yet within its depths swam a fierce, protective drive for the woman and child hidden within his walls. The woman, Alara, was the current vessel of the prophecy, a line of women burdened with a sight that drove most to madness. She was strong, yet fragile, her immense conviction a flickering candle against the relentless wind of her destiny. She was the one who feared him, despite the unspoken, years-long intimacy of their shared, isolated existence. Her terror was not of his nature. She knew his control was absolute, but of the power he represented, the ancient world he dragged with him. Her greatest fear, however, was for her daughter, Lyra. Lyra was a small, vibrant rebellion against the Gothic gloom of the anchor. The child, with eyes of impossible green that held the wisdom of 10,000 years, yet twinkled with pure, quietly hopeful innocence, was the true crux of the political thriller playing out in the dark. Lyra's hidden power, still dormant and unknown even to her mother, was the key to breaking the covenants and unleashing the ancient enemies Caelan had spent centuries keeping imprisoned. Her existence was a time bomb. Caelan watched over them both with the vigilance of a starving wolf guarding its last meal, a dual feeling of agonizing responsibility and profound, lonely attachment warring within his immortal heart. The night was pregnant with unease. The wind howled a low, melancholy note, and the air thickened, heavy with a scent Caelan knew instantly, the distinct metallic tang of an approaching supernatural threat, the unmistakable signature of the ancient enemy he thought he had entombed beneath the earth 1,000 years prior. His marble skin tightened, the perfect stillness of his body broken by the almost imperceptible drawing of breath, a habit of a life he no longer possessed. He heard the soft, quick patter of tiny feet on the aged floorboards before he heard the cry. Lyra, clad in a nightgown that seemed too bright for the surroundings, appeared in the doorway, her small hands clutching a worn cloth doll. Her green eyes were wide, but surprisingly steady, meeting his gaze with the unwavering focus of a true prophet. Caelan did not move, letting his presence be the anchor she clearly sought. The profound silence of the manor was finally broken by her sparse and purposeful voice, cutting through the high-stakes, dramatic tension like a sliver of ice. "Lord Caelan," she began, the address formal, just as Alara had taught her, though the name on her lips held a unique, trusting softness. The king inclined his head, waiting. He saw the shift in her focus, the slight tremor in her small frame that indicated the vision was already beginning to take hold. The curse and the blessing intertwined. Her little face was serious, the innocence momentarily overlaid with the grave conviction of someone much, much older. He held his breath, the air around him becoming taut, anticipating the pronouncement that would likely shatter the fragile peace of their isolation. This moment of intimate disclosure, a child confiding in the monster of the house, was perhaps the most dangerous of all. She walked forward slowly, each step sounding loud in the cavernous, oppressive silence, until she stood a mere arm's length from his knee, her head tilted up. She looked past him, towards the unlit stretches of the library, the skeletal branches outside the windows visible through the glass. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, conveying the weight of the moment, the true high-stakes nature of her perception. "The man Mommy's scared of," she reported, her eyes the only things moving, darting as if following an invisible shape, "is outside, and he is watching the windows." A cold spike drove into Kaelin's ancient heart, not of fear for himself. He welcomed combat, the brutal action that might distract him from his pervasive guilt, but of primal, fierce alarm for her. This was not a mere thief or stray ghoul. Lyra was sensing him, the Archon of the Fallen. Kaelin's eyes, fixed upon the small child who represented everything he was meant to destroy, but was instead sworn to protect, narrowed to pinpricks of light in the surrounding darkness. The unspoken name of the enemy hung like an executioner's axe. The words had been spoken, the mystery reveal begun. The Vampire King felt the familiar, terrifying surge of power, and for the first time in a century, the stillness of his being broke completely. Chapter 2. The revelation struck Kaelin like a physical blow, a brutal confirmation of the dread that had been festering beneath his composure. The Archon of the Fallen, or simply Malazar, the name tasted like ash and betrayal on the back of his tongue, had found them. This meant the ancient covenants, the very oaths Kaelin had spent centuries reinforcing with his own formidable will, were fraying, perhaps even broken. The mystery reveal was complete. The world was not safe, and their isolation was an illusion. The high-stakes escalation had begun. Kaelin knelt, dropping smoothly, his movements liquid grace, bringing his immense height down to Lyra's level. The child, sensing the shift in the air, the sudden, terrible focus of his attention, did not flinch. She was the one who had brought the terrifying knowledge, and she now waited with the conviction of a true messenger. Her scent, a delicate mix of milk, childhood sleep, and the unsettling, powerful presence of nascent magic, filled his senses. He used the moment of close-up focus on physical contact to check her small, thin wrist, seeking any sign of the Archon's residual taint, but found none. He had to be intimate yet formal, maintaining the delicate, necessary distance their dynamic required. "Tell me of the man, little anchor," Kaelin requested, his voice a low, melodic rumble, the sound of ancient marble shifting beneath the earth. He used the thematic word deliberately, hoping to steady her. "Describe what you see. Is he close? Is he one of the old blood or a servant?" He needed world-changing information, the smallest detail that would give him an advantage against a foe who had been his brother in arms, before becoming his eternal nemesis. Lyra closed her eyes, her face becoming a canvas for the unseen torment of the vision. She breathed in deeply, the innocent gesture overlaid with the melancholy weight of her prophetic burden. Her small hands, clutching the doll, tightened until her knuckles were white. Her description was poetic and highly descriptive, yet utterly terrifying in its content. "He is not one color," she whispered, her voice strained. "He is all the shadows mixed together, but there is a light inside him, like a terrible red jewel, and it makes the cold want to cry. He is very still, like you, Lord Kaelin, but he is hungry. He wants to eat the silence." Kaelin understood the metaphor instantly. Malazar was feeding on the residual covenant magic, using its weakening state as a conduit. He was not outside the walls. He was pressing against the very metaphysical boundary Kaelin had established. The situation was tense, calling for deliberately rhythmic pacing, slow, careful thought before the inevitable, sudden, brutal action. He stood, towering again, his figure now radiating an immense controlled power that crackled like frozen air. The atmosphere was suddenly gothic, high stakes, dramatic. He gently placed a hand on the child's shoulder, a gesture that was fiercely protective, the weight of his ancient guilt driving the need to shield her. "Go to your mother, Lyra," he instructed, his voice now sparse and purposeful. "Do not leave the great hall. I will secure the wards." The little girl, though the bearer of the worst news, nodded, accepting his authority and the unspoken, immense responsibility he was undertaking. She was defined by her immense conviction. As she turned, her small feet retracing their path across the floor, Kaelin's eyes flashed, a rapid, terrifying pulse of deep crimson that was only for her. It was a visual cue prompt signifying the activation of his true power, a silent oath sworn to the child. The Archon's arrival demanded a response that went beyond mere strategy. It required the unleashing of the very force Kaelin had sworn to keep dormant. He moved then, not walking, but flowing, a seamless, liquid grace of motion, towards a hidden recess in the wall. He threw open the concealed door, revealing a small, black iron chest. This was the Ethelrod, the vessel of the oaths, a relic of their shared bloody history. His task now was to attempt the impossible, to reinforce the covenant while simultaneously preparing for combat. He would engage Malazar in the physical world while holding the Archon's essence prisoner within the failing magical structure. The moment he touched the chest, he heard Alara's sharp, indrawn breath from the hall. She had seen the red flash, a sight that always triggered her deepest terror. She was the isolated prophet, now faced with the return of a past she had only heard whispered about. Her trauma was rooted in the knowledge that her line existed only as a mistake Kaelin now fought to correct. Her fear was justified. Kaelin could feel her eyes, watchful windows, upon his back. He did not look at her. He knew the central conflict was now fully external and internal. He had to earn her trust in the face of absolute terror, all while fighting a war of survival. The Archon was here for Lyra, for the hidden power he sought to harness to plunge the world into an eternal twilight. Kaelin opened the chest, revealing the shimmering black void inside. He reached in, plunging his hand into the nothingness, preparing for the ritual that would be both his salvation and perhaps his eternal ruin. The stark contrast between light-shadow was now literal, the ethereal glow of the ritual fighting against the encroaching, terrifying darkness of the Archon. He began to chant, the words ancient, guttural, and formal, the true language of the blood covenants. The high value and sparse dialogue of the moment was internal, a silent promise. I will not fail this time. I will not repeat the mistake. Chapter 3. The chanting reverberated through the vast echoing silence of the manor, a low, ancient thrumming that was more vibration than sound. Kaelin's hand was sunk to the elbow in the black void of the Ethelrod, drawing on the vast volatile power contained within, the oaths. The deliberately rhythmic pacing of the scene shifted here. The slow-burn atmospheric tension was replaced by a sense of immediate, overwhelming pressure. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and the metallic blood scent of potent magic. The sensory overload was immediate and all-consuming. His focus was absolute, an inhuman concentration honed by millennia of controlling forces that should have torn him apart. He was attempting a massive feat of supernatural engineering, restitching the very fabric of an ancient binding spell while simultaneously projecting a defensive barrier against an entity of near equal power. His mind was a battlefield, struggling against the Archon's relentless, invasive mental assault. Alara stood in the library entrance, bathed in the stark contrast between light-shadow, the soft, protective candlelight she preferred fighting against the encroaching darkness of the manor and the raw, violent power Kaelin was now manifesting. She watched him, her fear a tight, cold knot in her chest, yet her immense conviction kept her rooted. She was witnessing the Vampire King, the source of her deepest dread, become the very shield that protected her child. The duality was agonizing. Her internal conflict was paramount. Could she place her trust in the monster who had become their warden? She took a hesitant step forward. Her voice, when it came, was a breathy, intimate whisper that cut through the ancient chanting. "Kaelin," she said, using his name, the sound of it a declaration of their shared, isolated reality. He did not stop the ritual, but his head inclined slightly, a minimal movement acknowledging her presence and her courage. He could feel Lyra's small weight pressed against her mother's skirt, a silent, fiercely protective anchor. "Stay back, Alara," he warned, his voice strained by the effort of the spell. "The Archon is pressing. He seeks a weakness in the Covenant, a loophole. Do not give him one." His words were sparse and purposeful, a command veiled as a plea. She moved closer still, compelled by the same driven by guilt and loneliness necessity that defined him. They were two broken halves of a disastrous ancient choice, now facing the consequence together. "He does not seek a loophole," Alara responded, her voice strengthening, drawing on the prophetic sight that had always been her burden. "He seeks the vessel. He knows Lyra is here. I felt him, Kaelin. It was not a lingering presence. It was a hungry, directed gaze." Her dialogue line was high value, revealing a vital, immediate shift in the threat level. The Archon was no longer passively testing the boundary. He was actively searching for the child. The high-stakes escalation was now a matter of seconds. Kaelin roared, the sound more animal than man, a terrible noise that was wrenched from him by the sudden, overwhelming counterforce. The Archon had found a weak point, a seam in the old warding near Lyra's chamber. The ethereal black light of the Ethelrod ritual flared, momentarily illuminating the room in a grotesque, flickering chiaroscuro. Kaelin's eyes were now a continuous, solid, terrifying crimson. He pulled his hand out of the chest, the air where his arm had been shimmering violently. The magic triggering was complete, but the cost was evident in the thin silver lines of blood that sprang up across the marble skin of his hand, scars of the immense energy he had channeled. He turned, facing the wall that separated the library from the main staircase, his body now poised for sudden, brutal action. "He will enter through the upper floors," he stated, his voice now cold, deadly, and absolutely certain. "You will take Lyra and go to the crypt beneath the chapel. The old wards there are dormant, but physically intact. Do not look back." This was the true test of trust, an act of profound, agonizing vulnerability on his part, sending them to the one place in the manor that was completely outside his direct supervision. "No," Alara countered, her sparse refusal a declaration of intent. "I know this house better than anyone, Kaelin. The crypt is a trap. The Archon knows the weaknesses of the prophet's line. I will take Lyra to the observatory. It is the only place with an unobstructed view of the cliffs and the old signal fires. We will use the light ward." Her choice was final, an act of true self-determination that broke the mold of her character's trauma. Kaelin paused, recognizing the superior, if riskier, tactical decision. The duality of their positions was clear. He was the immortal shield, she was the human strategist. He nodded once, a short, impactful line of acceptance. "Then go," he commanded, his voice tight. "Go now. I will meet him on the staircase." He lifted his hands, his form blurring, and in the next heartbeat, two immense, black, razor-sharp blades of solidified shadow manifested in his grasp, humming with barely contained power. The Vampire King was ready for the combat. His final glance at Alara and Lyra was a look of pure, agonizing remembrance, a silent oath that he would hold the line. Chapter 4. Kaelin moved with a terrifying velocity, a shadow accelerated to impossible speed. He did not climb the grand staircase. He became a vertical streak of black velvet and solidified power. The pacing was now entirely sudden, brutal action. His focus was an unnatural singularity. Find the breach, meet the Archon, and hold the line until Alara and Lyra were safe within the observatory. The manor's silence was shattered by the immense thrum of his passing, the air recoiling from his sheer kinetic force. He reached the second-floor landing just as the air tore, not a physical break, but a violent metaphysical rupture in the old Covenant's boundary. The magic triggering was complete, and the Archon was through. Malazar stood in the middle of the hallway, a figure of profound Gothic menace. He was exactly as Lyra had described, a living amalgamation of shadows, his contours perpetually shifting, yet anchored by the sickening, pulsing light of a terrible red jewel in his chest. His appearance was a visual metaphor of pure, corrupt power, utterly devoid of the marble beauty that defined Kaelin. Malazar was the physical manifestation of betrayal, the ultimate ancient enemy. His eyes, when they focused on Kaelin, were empty sockets of swirling violet void. The silence that followed their collision was deeper than any sound, a vacuum of absolute high-stakes confrontation. Kaelin, Malazar hissed, his voice a dry, rasping sound, like rust flaking from ancient iron. The name was drawn out, laced with 1,000 years of bitter resentment and ironic amusement. My self-exiled brother, still playing the righteous guardian, I see, still shackled by your guilt. His dialogue was high value, immediately cutting to the core of Kaelin's internal conflict. The prophetic line must be extinguished. It is the only way to release the true power, to achieve dominion. Why do you protect the fire that will ultimately consume you? Kaelin did not speak. His response was sparse and purposeful, a low, guttural snarl followed by an immediate, devastating offensive. The two solidified shadow blades flew from his hands, propelled by a force that buckled the antique floorboards. Malazar laughed, a short, unpleasant sound, and the blades dissolved into mere smoke an inch from his body. This was not a physical contest. It was a war of fundamental power. Kaelin closed the distance, his speed defying perception. He launched a massive, open-handed strike, seeking to disorient, to buy time. The Archon met him with equal force. The impact was not a crash, but a terrifying, silent implosion of air. Kaelin felt the sheer, corrosive supernatural threat of Malazar's essence, a raw, chaotic force that sought to unmake him. The king's inhuman nature allowed him to withstand the blow, but he was thrown back, skidding across the wooden floor, digging furrows with his heels. Meanwhile, downstairs, Alara rushed Lyra towards the west wing, their path a silent, frantic sprint through the oppressive, echoing halls. The child, sensing the brutal action above, was utterly silent, clinging to her mother's hand. Alara's close, third-person internal monologue was a torrent of tense decision-making. The observatory, the light ward. It was a forgotten relic, a ceremonial warding used by the prophets of old to call on the celestial powers when facing overwhelming demonic forces. It required an immense conviction and a physical sacrifice, one she was ready to make. She was defined by her trauma, but also by her fierce love, a love that negated her fear of Kaelin and the Archon alike. Back on the landing, Kaelin rose, his frame still immensely powerful, but a thin, dark fluid, not blood, but a condensation of pure, spent power, trickled from the corner of his mouth. Malazar was stronger than he had anticipated, the Archon's millennia of imprisonment seemingly having only honed his malice. Your oath to them is meaningless, Malazar taunted, his form solidifying into a more recognizable, yet horrifyingly handsome shape, a visual metaphor of their shared ancient blood. We were gods once, Kaelin. Do you truly choose to die beautifully for a mortal line, for this burden of remembrance? Kaelin finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and filled with a cold, absolute resolve. It was his only line of high value and sparse dialogue in the exchange. I choose choice, he stated, and my choice is to guard what is fragile, brother. My duality is my strength. He launched himself forward again, not with blades, but with the full, devastating force of his vampiric power. The combat was now an escalation of sheer willpower, a desperate, character-driven conflict arc playing out in a crumbling manor house. Kaelin's goal was simple: pin Malazar in the upper hall, keep him distracted, and buy Alara the time she needed to activate the Light Ward. He welcomed the potential ruin, the betrayals of his own body. He embraced the pain, for it was the ultimate, purifying expression of his guilt. Chapter 5. Alara burst into the observatory, dragging Lyra behind her. The room was a circular chamber set high in the west tower, its glass dome offering a panoramic, terrifying view of the raging storm and the black, skeletal branches of the surrounding forest. The sensory-rich sentences here describe the cold, the wind, and the relentless, ominous presence of the Archon's power pressing in on the fragile structure. The very air in the room felt electrified, heavy with the promise of supernatural threat. She pushed Lyra into the absolute center of the circular chamber, where a massive, ancient compass rose was carved into the cold stone floor, its lines dusted with centuries of neglect. "Stand there, little anchor," Alara commanded, her voice firm, stripped of all but purpose. "Do not move, no matter what you see." Her eyes swept the room, looking for the activation mechanism of the Light Ward. It was not a magical item, but a crude ceremonial device, a basin carved from pure, colorless crystal set upon a short marble pedestal. She remembered the texts. The prophet must pour a physical sacrifice into the basin to trigger the protective spell. This was the moment of her true, immense conviction. She was no longer running from the past. She was embracing the hidden power within her, the power that Malazar sought to crush. She took a knife from her belt, a simple, non-magical steel blade. Kaelin had insisted she always carry a weapon. Her movement was sparse and purposeful, reflecting the deliberately rhythmic pacing leading up to a climax. A massive crack echoed from the stairwell, a sound that shook the very foundations of the tower, signaling the increasing ferocity of the battle above. Kaelin was holding the line, but he was struggling. Alara knew the Vampire King could not hold the Archon indefinitely. She pressed the blade into the palm of her hand, the steel cutting through her skin with surprising ease. The blood, bright and warm against the cold, immediately began to flow, dripping into the colorless crystal basin. This was the close-up focus on physical contact of the ritual. The scent of her own blood scent, the unique signature of the prophetic line, immediately triggered a reaction from the crystal. It began to glow, a soft, ethereal white light that pushed back the encroaching shadows. Above, Kaelin took a devastating blow. Malazar's power, channeled through his hatred and their shared history, struck the king in the chest. Kaelin felt ancient bones groan, the structure of his inhuman nature momentarily compromised. He crashed against the marble banister, the stone cracking under his weight. A torrent of dark power, a viscous, chilling force, immediately began to consume him. He was losing. But as his body began to fail, he felt a sudden, profound spike of energy from below. A pure, radiating light. The Light Ward. Alara, Malazar, sensing the magics, screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that defied description. "The prophetess! No, the Light Ward will bind me. The covenant will be whole again." He turned, abandoning the battle with Kaelin, his form blurring as he shot down the staircase, a black torrent of rage. The high-stakes escalation had reached its peak. Kalen, his body shattered, his vision blurring in a terrifying momentary loss of control, forced himself up. His only thought, his only driving force, was the fiercely protective oath he had made to Lyra. He manifested the last of his immense power, not for defense, but for one final, desperate offensive. He knew he could not catch Malazar. Instead, he channeled all his remaining power, his loneliness and his guilt, into a single devastating pulse. The library exploded in a silent burst of raw shadow magic, collapsing a massive section of the staircase directly onto Malazar's path. Kalen did not know if the attack would stop the Archon, but it would slow him down. It was his choice, his final act of self-sacrifice. He slumped against the shattered banister, his life force ebbing, the melancholy truth of his inevitable death finally settling upon him. He had held the line. Below, the crystal basin was overflowing with white, pure light. Alara, pale and trembling, stepped back from the pedestal, her hand bleeding freely. The light ward was active, but she knew it was only a defense. As the light filled the room, she looked at Lyra, who stood silently in the center of the compass rose, an anchor in the storm. The little girl looked back, her quietly hopeful eyes meeting her mother's, and the raw, unfiltered power of the prophecy, her true nature, finally awoke within her. Chapter 6. The shattering impact of the collapsed staircase bought Kalen precious seconds, but it was not enough. Malazar burst through the rubble, his form, temporarily twisted by the raw, physical force, screaming his rage. He knew the light ward was active. He could feel the pure, supernatural threat of its power, a binding force that would seal him away, perhaps forever. His supernatural romance with domination was being thwarted by the very thing he sought to control. He flew towards the observatory, a black storm of hate, only to be stopped at the threshold by the blinding, radiating shield of the light ward. Inside the observatory, Alara stood between Malazar and Lyra, her trauma replaced by a singular, cold focus. She was the prophet, accepting the burden of her role. Malazar pounded against the shield, a terrible, guttural roar escaping him. "You cannot hold me, prophetess. The ward is fueled by blood, and your life will run out. Where is your vampire king now? Where is the self-loathing guardian who swore to protect you? He lies dying in his self-made ruins." Alara did not flinch, her gaze steady. Her dialogue was now her final, absolute declaration, her high-value statement of conviction. "He held the line, Malazar. He gave me the time to choose." As she spoke, the child Lyra, standing within the compass rose, began to glow. Her powers, now fully awakened by the combined stress and the light ward's purity, began to manifest. This was the final, total mystery reveal. The power Malazar sought was not a weapon, but a focus, a lens. Lyra was the ultimate anchor. On the landing, Kalen forced his broken body to crawl, driven by a primal need for remembrance, not of his past mistakes, but of his final, correct choice. He used the last of his focus to project a single, intimate thought to Alara, a final communication in the language of the ancient languages, terminology of the bloodlines. "Forgive me, my anchor." Alara received the thought, and a single tear tracked a path through the grime on her cheek. She understood. Kalen had not just bought her time, he was going to sacrifice his very essence to power the final seal. She turned to Lyra, the child now a beacon of white celestial fire. "Lyra," Alara whispered, "close your eyes, little bird, and be the light." The Archon, sensing Kalen's impending ritual, let out one last, terrible shriek and threw his entire being against the light ward. The shield cracked, a single, devastating fracture running down the center. He was through. But as he lunged for Lyra, Kalen's final act took effect, a colossal, roaring wave of black shadow magic, The Ethelrod's final, released power slammed into the back of Malazar. This was the ultimate character-driven conflict arc resolution. The king's self-hatred and guilt channeled into a final, fiercely protective attack. Malazar was momentarily paralyzed, caught between the black binding force of Kaelin's essence and the pure, white celestial fire of Lyra's emerging prophecy. The duality of power was perfect, shadow magic and pure light locked in a brutal, final embrace. Malazar, caught in the ultimate betrayal of his expectations, began to dissolve, not into smoke, but into dust, the terrible red jewel in his chest, extinguishing with a final, dying hiss. The light faded. The supernatural threat was gone. Lyra, untouched and unharmed, stood blinking in the silent, glass-domed room. Alara, utterly spent, dropped to her knees. A minute later, a low thud echoed from the landing above. Kaelin. Alara rushed out, finding the Vampire King lying half-collapsed amidst the rubble. His marble skin was cracked and gray, his beautiful, terrible form utterly still. His eyes, the color of frozen twilight, were closed. She knelt beside him, checking for a heartbeat that had not existed for millennia, but instead found a single, fragile pulse of warmth in his cold wrist, a final, infinitesimal surge of energy. He was not dead, but dormant, his essence nearly spent, his penance paid in full. The man of ancient guilt was finally at peace. She took his hand, her bloody, scarred palm resting on his, accepting the true intimacy of their shattered lives. She looked at Lyra, who stood silently in the doorway, her small face radiating a profound, quietly hopeful wisdom. The Vampire King had chosen to be her shield. The high-stakes battle was over. Alara pulled Kaelin's magnificent, broken body closer, resting her cheek against his cold chest. The loneliness of her existence was finally, truly broken.